start again. Thank you for joining us on time. While we're waiting just a minute, I want to announce that there are flyers outside. Tulare County is inviting you to a prevention coalition on September 24th, in which Dr. Sabat will be speaking again. If you want to go hear him again, please see some of Tulare County and one of the flyers that's available. How marijuana impacts youth in our schools is a central concern in any discussion around marijuana use. I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of the panel, Mr. David Mineta, who worked in the White House under President Obama and has come home to serve as President and CEO of Momentum for Mental Health. Joining him is Kenya Edison from San Jose's Eastside Union School District, who's just joining us, which has 16 sites and 23,000 students. Next to her, we have Mr. Gordon Jackson, who's from the State Office of Education, in the Department of Education, from the Superintendent's Office. And at the end, we have Mr. Ralph Castro, who's an Associate Dean at Stanford University. Thank you each for joining us today, and I'll turn the time over to Mr. Mineta.
Thank you very much, Sue, and I want to thank the organizers for this amazing day, both District Attorney Rosen and Supervisor Chavez, for really taking this on, I think, as an important issue to the community. And especially I want to thank Patrick and Sue for, I think, being the backbone of this effort, making sure it happened, and making sure that these are some of the, not even just the most respected national experts on these topics, but in many cases, the most respected international experts. And I say this about many of my former colleagues. Dr. Madrasa will be up here tomorrow, and Dr. Sabat, Dr. Hustis. These are folks that have devoted their lives to science and sound policy. And I am so proud and honored to have spent some time in the federal government so that I can actually go from conferences and listening to them to actually being able to work with them and learn from them on a both professional and personal basis. So for that, I want to thank Bertha, Kevin, Marilyn, sort of eternally for that, for their graciousness and collegiality. So, what do we have before us? We have a panel after lunch, which is challenging. So, and we're following Kevin. Really? I told him that's something I just don't ever want to do. And after Kevin left ONDCP, after left the White House, and we would be on similar panels or conferences, we'd always I'd make sure we pulled that White House card and said, I have to go before Kevin. There's no way I'm going after this guy. No way. And here I find myself going after. So, this important topic, as Sue said, we are fortunate to have, yet I think, some fantastic panelists and experts to talk to us about this intersection between marijuana use and its effects on our students and schools. And I have to say, this is something that is a really central part of the discussion and needs to be probably a much greater part of this discussion moving forward. Now, just to introduce the panelists a little bit more, before I do that, I want to show you for the 15th time the same slides. Because federal government likes to do repetition, and we like using certain data points a lot. And I'm not with the federal government anymore, but the slides are everlasting. And with that, my apologies, because John showed these slides, and then Kevin showed these slides. Some of the points are going to be similar in that way. And as you get the slide decks, I think I would encourage you to use liberally and educate your staff, clients, families you work with around some of these slides, because we're showing them again and again. They make such a difference to us. We've been on the road with them, and they really do tell an important tale. Obviously for this one, this divergence and between marijuana use versus perceived risk of occasional marijuana use, we can see again how this is moving. This slide, I think Kevin and John pointed out in 2009. More in the future study, we think that at the time with MODCP, we showed in 2007 this divergence. And I think it's key for us. We've done such a good job as a country around cigarette use and adolescence. We really have to keep our eye on the prize around marijuana use and students. Finally, John showed this specifically for marijuana, teen marijuana use, but I want to show escalation of drug use during the teen years. And again, remind folks that right in here, right, this is in the 12 to about 22, 23-year-old time frame. That escalation of use and how important that period of that doubling of rates, how important it is for us to concentrate our efforts in both information, discussion. I'd have to say as well, having worked in treatment, adolescent treatment, for some period of years with Bay Area nonprofits, Asian American Recovery Services staff who are here today, that how important all of this really is. And I'd say we lead this slide up through an entire presentation to show folks, communities, how important that particular life developmental stage, how important it is. So as we get into the panelists, our esteemed panelists, I want to leave you just with a simple story. I was 10 years on a local school board in northern San Mateo County, the Jefferson High School District. And there we learned about high THC marijuana being used by students in the district, our 9th and 12th graders. We shared a common attendance area with San Francisco Unified. And I had great concerns about marijuana that was coming out of dispensaries, high THC content, and making its way into an adolescent population or student population. One thing, and I say this as a progressive, is that is really difficult for, I think, many progressives, is a discussion around the educational achievement gap, particularly among folks of color, students of color, and its relationship and connection to marijuana use. So one of the things we did while I was in DC is we talked about this with civil rights groups, and folks were really concerned, rightly so, around incarceration. Trying to point out what this looks like in schools and its relationship between student use of marijuana and other substances and their educational achievement is something that I think we as a community it is imperative for us to actually have those conversations with folks. That's why these slide decks are so important. That's why the panelists, what they're going to say, and questions that you have for the panelists are so key today. So with that, I would like to go back and reintroduce our panelists for today. And our first panelist, Kenya Edison, the Director of Student Services from the East Side Union High School District, a district that I know very well. I feel like I've served in that district at those many schools for a very, very long time, interned at YB love that district. And so we're very fortunate to have Kenya with us today. So Kenya, no, it's well, yeah, this is your spiel, but if you wouldn't mind sharing with everybody though, and this is pretty targeted, I'm sure you were already ready for, just kind of the use of marijuana and its impacts on high school students and on the schools, right? So it's not just the individual student, but it's on the entire learning environment.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. I serve in the place of Chris Funk, my superintendent. He had a schedule conflict, and this was probably more appropriate for me anyhow, because this is the realm that I kind of oversee for the district. Marijuana use is not an individual habit, and I say that because there's a relationship piece to that. Students who show up to campus who are under the influence are in relationships with either teachers, students, or just the campus in and of itself. So in preparation for today, I always have the district-wide lens because I oversee all of discipline across the district and referrals, supports, and services, of which many of you are our community partners, and I definitely say thank you for that. But I also wanted the feedback from our troops on the ground, which is our principals, our social workers, our advisors, and everyone that actually are touching kids. I miss being on a campus. It's my first love, but I knew that policy and practices was my strength, so I just followed suit. And one of the things that is consistent is the impact on the environment. At Eastside, we are changing our lens on how we just approach schools and students and how we interact in a relationship with parents to a very social, emotional, warming lens and perspective. So the use of marijuana is not the alarm anymore. We're focusing on the why. Why are kids using? Is it self-medication? Is it recreational? Is it that I get dropped off by an older sibling who smokes on the way and I get out the car smelling like it? And so every day, yes, I just smell like marijuana. So getting to that why is really important. We know any drug, right? Not just marijuana, but marijuana is the major one. Definitely has an adverse effect on the learning environment, not simply because a kid is under the influence and they can't access the instruction that's being provided, as we work really hard to make sure it's quality instruction for every student. If a student shows up under the influence, that access that they have has also had an adverse effect on it. But it's also just how teachers respond, how advisors respond. Are we referring to supports before we're excluding from instruction? Are we taking that time to say why are students using? I was saying I was crunching data before I headed over here today. Our unofficial numbers and looking in our system, referrals for marijuana use represent about 6% of all of our discipline referrals for this year. But of that 6%, so about 266 kids or incidents with individual kids, 255 were referred to a social worker because of a drug offense. So our response is great. A little bit over 95% of our kids are being referred to a support, not just a discipline, and that's where we need to get. But I have to say the other impact is we're limited in resources. And although we have amazing community partners that really offer drug awareness counseling for students and drug awareness workshops for parents and interventions at all walks, we also have this issue of having a sensationalized demographic on certain campuses that CBOs or nonprofits say, I need to work there because you have reporting mandates. Or it's a Medi-Cal program, and that for us doesn't work when we have 16 campuses with very diverse backgrounds and demographics. So it is an issue for us to address how do we make sure there's equity and access to the supports around marijuana use. How do we make sure that all of our parents get the knowledge in hand so that they can support at sites? How do we make sure that when a student walks in a classroom and smells of marijuana, that they're not berated in front of the class and said, get out of here, you smell, and I'm about to call admin. But we really take that opportunity to dig a little deeper and find out why. A lot of our students are honest about their usage, and that's one of the things that social workers have reported. That yes, I smoke, yes, it's probably every day, They're not in denial about it, but we also understand that not everyone is ready to receive supports. And so that is a balance for us. How do we make sure that while we're making sure we're really working on making that we have quality instruction, that we're not forgetting to address the other hurdles that come between kids accessing that instruction. And marijuana usage is a big one. So the initial discipline is probably not happening immediately out on sites now that we have social workers, which was a great investment for the district. They are being referred for an additional support or assessment to see where they are with their usage. Are they ready to change? Is it self-medication? Did they have something that was traumatic that happened in their life that really pushed them to needing to cope, right? And even as adults, sometimes coping is a challenge. So that piece of it is major for us. We are always open for more partners, right? We always are trying to fill the gaps. But sometimes it is an equity and access issue when we talk about if we have a high Medi-Cal at one school and maybe none at another, then this school doesn't get supports, and that necessarily isn't helping us as a system. So I'm always willing to talk to folks if you want to bring stuff in, so we can definitely talk about that.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Kenny. And I think we will have time for some questions a little bit later. So if you can, write them down on index cards, and staff will be around to pick those up. Up next is the Associate Dean of Student Affairs, and who is also the Director of the Office of Alcohol Policy and Education at Stanford University, Ralph Castro. And Ralph and I had a little bit of a chance before our panel just to discuss some of the concerns and issues that he works on. And similarly, Ralph, as we did with Kenya, if also you can just talk about the multiple effects on Stanford's campus, as you've addressed, alcohol use as well, but what impact marijuana use is having both on students and academics, and also the college campus at large.
Again, thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here and speak with you, and for all of you taking the time out to be here and talk about this important topic. 90% of my time we talk about alcohol, so I'm glad that we're finally talking about something else. But I will say, what's happening in my view is that marijuana is this new paradigm shift in regards to drug use, particularly within higher ed. So I want to frame this from my perspective. I've been a higher ed educator and administrator for 20 years, and have seen the trends that are going on. And when we talk about drug education, alcohol education, that has to be the core of what we do. And we're at a situation right now when we look at the Monitoring the Future data, that at this point right now, the 2014 data that just was released out of Monitoring the Future shows that, daily or near daily marijuana use among college students is highest today than it has been since 1980. Now, as we talked about earlier, the percentage of THC in what they're smoking now is significantly higher than it was in 1980, right? So it's higher, but it's higher at a higher risk. And what does that mean, daily or near daily use? I mean, that is something that impacts people's lives. And in the presentation earlier, those are the people that are needed in order to keep an industry going. Absolutely, right? Now there are, if we look at 30-day use with college students, it goes anywhere from 30 to 20% of college students report having used marijuana in the past 30 days. That's high. California tends to have a little bit higher rates with college students than other places, generally because of some of the availability and access. And I'll talk a little bit about decriminalizing and the law and how that has created some of a quagmire for us. But the other thing was, as this use has gone up, obviously, not to beat a dead horse, but the perceived harm has gone down. So, there's this dichotomy of increased use, decreased perceived harm. And so, some of the other troubling things that had come out of some of the recently released data from Monitoring the Future also showed not only is it with marijuana, but cocaine use has gone up as well as ecstasy. So we did see a little bit of a dip with ecstasy, and it's back. It is that generational thing that we're seeing. And so as an educator, it's like I have to keep educating on this all the time. And it's a 4-year cycle on a college campus, right? Because once you're done after 4 years, it's a whole new cycle that comes in with high school, I mean, any school in that way, in order to keep up on what we're looking at. So, you know, the interesting thing that we look at is California has done a tremendous job around tobacco, right? Banning it in restaurants, bars, all over. And we have a social norm on our campus at Stanford where students don't put up with smoking. The social norm is do not smoke here, do not smoke indoors. Students will call you out on it. And they see that as bad. They know that it can cause harm. But there's a disconnect when we look at it with marijuana, because then they go, well, this is natural. This is medicinal. It doesn't have the same harm. But we know that if you look at the daily use of marijuana smoking, the carcinogenic levels are just as dangerous as tobacco, you know, and there's a disconnect. And that, as an educator, is creating this middle space for ambivalence to say, you're saying this, but this is what's going on. How do you make sense of that? And that is where I live as an educator, is trying to get students to really try to come together with that. And education, hopefully, is what bridges that gap. Now, we have some protective factors with smoking because of the social norm that we have, so we're able to do that. But I will say, what we are seeing, and particularly where I'm most concerned about in higher ed and everywhere, as we've seen, is the increasing use of edibles and other forms of cannabis. I've been watching closely in other states, in Colorado, increases in emergency department visits for kind of overdoses. We have seen cases where students ingest too much and then have a psychotic episode or have a paranoid episode. And they're used to drugs that they take that almost have an immediate effect. I mean, alcohol can take up to 20 minutes, but they're used to that. With an edible, it's ingested 45 minutes to an hour later. After half an hour, they're impatient. Well, maybe I should take more. Maybe I should take more. They end up taking, first of all, they're taking a lot in the beginning to begin with. They can take, 20, 30 milligrams, which is going to create a negative output for them, and they don't understand that. And so what we need to do is, what I'm hoping to do is to really start to educate on the risk factors, right? So, we talk about alcohol, we talk about, hard alcohol right now at Stanford is a big issue about creating harm. It's a higher risk because of the percentage of alcohol by volume. I'm looking at, with cannabis, edibles and some of the oils and things as the same kind of process because of the potential for harm that's there with these students that are making poor choices. And again, if you look at the edibles, they're colorful, they're gummies, they're chocolate bars. The student that passed away in Colorado was a University of Wyoming student. I'm a graduate of the University of Wyoming. That hit close to home. I spoke with people back at the university, when that happened. That was a tragedy. And I don't think that's an isolated incident. I think that there are potentially harms that we're not necessarily seeing that are still happening. So on a college campus, we have a little bit of a luxury in both ways. One is that as an institution of higher education that receives federal funds, we have to abide by the Drug-Free Schools Act, by federal law. So under our policies, regardless of legalization, cannabis will be illegal under our policy because it mirrors federal law. So it's easier within the policy realm, but it gets difficult in the day-to-day realm. And so, for instance, right now, if a student has less than an ounce of marijuana on them, and the police come in contact with them, they cite them for the citation, and they pay their fine. We still see that as an affront to our policy, and we require them to come in for structured education. We're doing brief interventions with those students. But there's the conversation where it's like, well, how are you able to do this? And we have to educate students on the issue of federal versus state law. But it is a constant challenge for us to educate students on that, because they think, well, I'm in the state of California, therefore, if I walk across the street, then it's okay for me to do this. But if I'm in this area, is that, you know, and so it really complicates a lot of the educational efforts that we have to do. But we really try to go beyond that and just think about this, of the type of harm that it is causing. Policy is one piece. A lot of schools, I know, are starting to reframe marijuana policies and think about how they're able to be more explicit. Because, to be honest, a lot of controlled substance and marijuana policies are really directed towards kind of smoking marijuana. They're not made for all of this new type of ingestion. And so that's something that's an ongoing conversation as well. And I think the landscape in higher ed, as we look at what's going to happen over the next few months, this is going to be the new frontier of the type of education that we're going to have to do with our students.
Very good. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to reintroduce Mr. Gordon Jackson from the California Department of Education, CDE. And Mr. Jackson, Gordon is the Director of the Coordinated Student Support Division of CDE.
Thank you. And after all that I've heard this morning,
Gordon, I'm sorry. If I could, I don't want to leave you out of the facilitated question piece. So just that I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. Sue would remind me. So again, you know, given your job and what you do and statewide sort of view on this, again, how has the use of marijuana affected schools and students sort of across the state of California? We've heard from Ralph on especially Stanford and what they're doing, Kenya across the district, but from your vantage point from CDE, you get the whole thing, ball of wax in the state. So, thank you.
okay, well, as a preface to that, I'll say that after all that I've heard this morning, and I've learned a great deal, I'm compelled to just say, get up. But I won't do that. When I think about the 6.1 million students in the state of California, the 10,500 schools, the 300,000 teachers, the 1,128 school districts, I recognize that this is a huge mechanism that could have a huge impact on the future of California. And so as we're having conversations about marijuana use and its impact on students, we should also be sure that we're having those conversations looking more globally about California and the health of California and the expectations and what we need to happen so that California continues to thrive. The use of marijuana by our students is a huge, huge situation. Primarily because when we think about academic standards and the Common Core and the expectations for students to learn and thrive and be successful, when we think about California as a state with the majority of our students are students of color, and once we dismiss any conversation about intelligence and how that rates with students of color, no. Once we get into the conversation about needs, about equity, and about what matters most, we recognize that too often, for a whole host of historical reasons in California and the nation as it relates to drugs and marijuana, that too often those students are greatly impacted by conversations about it, by our understandings of it, by hearing now about the medicinal components and why it's just not that big of a deal. And so all of that is happening at the same time that there's this belief that every student can succeed and that every student has the right to an education. And yet, whenever there is something that steps in the way, some barrier, something that thwarts those efforts, it's a real concern. Marijuana is one of those things. It has a huge impact on student engagement, on student participation. You know, we've heard some of the things said earlier about just what happens to the brain and how, in essence, it's not the motivator, it's not the engager. And so when that is happening, and students are farther and farther, or further and further disconnected from school, that's a concern, especially when the expectations are really high. Attendance. You know, there are parents that think, well, you know, we're going to go away for this 4-day weekend. When I ask a parent, well, how often is your child absent? 2 days a month, you know, they're pretty good, they got great grades. Not fully recognizing that 2 days a month equals a month of lost learning throughout the course of a year. And that attendance, that chronic absence, that lethargy, that disconnection can very much be attributed to the use of marijuana in so many instances. We know that the climate of the school matters, and as much as we don't have enough of the conversations about relationships, we know, those of us that are educators and those of you that are parents, we know that relationships matter. And that when that student is talking about his or her school day and what really worked and what made it an exciting day, more often than not, it's not because they just discovered what X equals. But more often than not, it's because of the relationships with their peers and the climate of their school. And we've done a lot of work recently just fully understanding and better developing our understanding of the role of climate and how that matters for both staff and students. And marijuana and the use of it has a very negative impact on the climate of the school, for those who use and for those who are not users, but are subjected to circumstances created by the users. So it's truly an opportunity for us to look at this, what's going on here and now, yay or nay. It's not about the department taking a position, although one could likely assume what that position might be about the bill. But it's an opportunity for us to be mindful of all of the energy in this room and in every room, in a very collaborative spirit, to really start focusing in on avoidance. How is it that we can boost our understanding and the knowledge of others and the awareness of others that then allows that student to make the choice at the very beginning of, I don't want to go there. That's a cute little dummy that's shaped like a horse and that's really cool, but I don't want to go there. That, I think, that prevention piece is going to have a very huge impact, and ultimately a very huge impact on the future that as an educator in California after some 40 years, I'm really concerned about. Because the students that I remember when I was teaching, the student that I was, when I'm in schools now, more often than not, I'm not seeing that student. I'm seeing students that are disconnected and thinking somebody else needs to fix the world without realizing that that somebody else is wearing their shoes. And marijuana and the use of simply gets in the way.
Thank you, Gordon. Clearly, we are very fortunate to have such distinguished and expert panelists today to take advantage of this time. If you could, I think we've got time for some questions. If you could fill out your cards and just wave them in the air. We'll come by and pick them up. And if I could, maybe I'd like to ask just sort of a starting question coming around now. And just to get this started, I would just ask, from your three perspectives, what is it that kind of works in this conversation with schools? How can the communities, how can folks outside, or both maybe inside and outside education, how can we have these conversations to make it effective on campus around issues around students in marijuana use?
I'll start. That way my answer is the best answer. For us, it's how do we have the conversations with parents and all caretakers or any important person in a young person's life, as well as let's have a conversation about equitable access and supports. So, and how do we make sure San Jose is just demographically diverse? That's the reality, that's the richness of it. How are we making sure that that information, that there are resources for parents, is getting out in every language it needs to, in every community it needs to, in every venue? Everything can't be online because not everyone has access to a computer or internet. How do we make sure that when a parent walks in and they're frustrated whether they've come through the district or your agency or institution, and they didn't get help, that the second time they went to someone that they weren't turned away. For us, it's a matter of parents sometimes just don't know. I know we like to say if a kid lives in your house, you should know what's going on with them 24/7. But that's not the reality. A lot of our families and parents are working 2 and 3 jobs to keep the roof. So they may not be there when a student comes in from school. And so they're maybe not smelling that very distinct odor, or they've transitioned, as my colleague has said, to another form of usage that is not detected. And so how do we make sure parents know what they're looking for? It's not a joint all the time anymore, you know? So how do they know that now all of a sudden my kid didn't like chocolates and they always have brownies now? How do they know that they have Carmex bottles that are empty and there's this little wax in there and I don't know what that is? You know, how do we inform them so that they can be the additional eyes? For us as a district, it's informing, making sure that anyone on our campuses is aware of the supports as well as with marijuana, the effects of marijuana, so when they see a student, they can address it. But it's so much bigger than that. How do we say, okay, churches, can you host a night at your church for your congregation and invite dads to do a presentation? Like, how do we not ask the community centers to say, can you host a, this is what, literally, let's go back. This is what drugs do to your brain, right? Let's go back to the egg commercial. Crack, here it is, sizzling. For me, that would be how you can support educators, is by helping to widen the net of the knowledge.
And the one thing that I'll add really quickly, and all of that was spot on, is the idea of messaging, is the idea of using whatever variety of communication method that we have to really message and to really help parents and staff and students and community members put the child in the center of that piece of paper, that student, and start looking at that whole student and the needs of that whole student, and really having that conversation, because that really resonates with parents. No parent is likely to, even if the student doesn't look like their student, they're not likely to say, well, I don't care what happens to that kid. When you're starting to have that conversation about what matters most, you can then have a very candid conversation about all of the resources and all of the things that support that student's success.
Yeah, I would add, you know, when we do prevention, we're primary prevention, we're always a step or two kind of behind where popular culture is. We're always playing catch up. I think in this area, we may be a few more steps behind because it's been so clandestine and it's been, you know, the forbidden, and it's come to the forefront so quickly and it's evolving rapidly. Things, I mean, 3 years ago, if someone had talked to me about edibles, I would have been, you know, dumbfounded. And I've had to educate myself on this. So I think educating parents is a big thing. Educating the community on this, getting accurate information out there is important. But I agree, there is a disconnect, generational disconnect, I think, with parents, and I see this in college students too, about what they think is happening. Their perceived harm around marijuana is low as well. But then you talk about, well, do you know about, you know, all of these other aspects of cannabis use? And they're like, no, what is that, right? So I spend a lot of time educating parents just as much as I do students.
Thank you. One of a thread of some of the questions is around discipline and consequences of discipline or punishment, all the way from suspensions or expulsions to actually arrests and either misdemeanor or felony charges. And so just, if you could, just talk about, because we had to catch up so quickly around, and we're still playing catch up, around our discipline policies. We worked, I know that for the last many years we were looking at sort of school to prison kind of pipeline issues as well. And so if you could talk about sort of discipline and discipline policies.
I'll go first. This is a huge issue. Part of it is disproportionate minority contact when it comes to some of our discipline practices, where you start looking at a school that has 1,500 students, it has perhaps 200 African American students, and when you start looking at who is disciplined, who is suspended, who is sent home, it's 130 African American students. And so it's very disproportionate. And that's a real concern. And so what is going on, because California was under some great heat by the Office of Civil Rights, the Federal Office of Civil Rights, because we had such a huge disproportionate count, that now we're looking at really moving away from out-of-school suspension, looking at other methods, positive behavior interventions and supports, looking at restorative practices, with a full understanding that it's time for us to look at what is going on. It's time to have conversations with children, not about why did you do that, but what is happening to you? What has happened to you? Because trauma in the lives of our students is huge. And more often than not, that is a consequence and a result that results in behavior. So school discipline is being revamped considerably, and there's some districts, including LA, that are doing some masterful things at revisioning how we do that, with the full recognition that with all the resources and all the efforts that we're trying to put in place to support students, sending them off campus and at home for 5 days is the antithesis of what we want to do.
I would also say changing that norm of that you have to discipline a marijuana use, so you have to discipline a student who had a knife. Sometimes it's that groundwork of in the investigation, you find that there's something else going on. And then how do you have the conversation with your colleagues who are like, but they're just still here. Nothing happened, right? So that conversation of changing that lens, I totally agree. It has to be student focused. Yes, we balance having and maintaining safe campuses for all of our students and making sure that it's an environment conducive to education. But we also have to make sure that as we're educating parents and students, that we're educating the system that our approaches have not worked. Yes, there has to be consequences, but there also have to be remedies, because we're out for positive outcomes. We don't want to just sit around and say, yay, we suspended 900 kids this year for marijuana. It's like, whoa, of those 900 kids, only 5 of them are repeat offenders. Like, that would be ideal, right? Just 5 of the 900. But so that conversation is a courageous conversation with colleagues when you're trying to change a system. Because status quo is, I send them, this happens, something happened, they're not here. And how do we say, oh no, they're still here, but they were plugged into something. Next time it may be a different consequence. So that's a courageous conversation.
Thank you. That was a fantastic conversation. We appreciate the advice and the wisdom, I think, that you were able to share with all of us. But I think it's, as many of you, this day is about the beginning conversations, right? We aren't in the middle, we aren't in the end, we're at the beginning of these conversations. And we need to take this out far and wide. So not only just across Santa Clara County, but across the region, across the state. So with that, I want to thank all 3 of you for your great wisdom today. And invite Sue up here for the next piece. Thank you.
Well, thank you to those presenters. I think you all agree with me. We would love to have more time to hear from them and their words of wisdom. It's most inspiring.